Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us today. It is a great pleasure to welcome you to our today's webinar, which is co-organized by the World Value Survey Association and Research Committee number 20 on comparative sociology of the International Sociological Association. Our today's webinar addresses a highly timely and important topic, the relationship between globalization, populism, and climate skepticism. Today's presentation examines how different forms of populist attitudes are associated with public responses to climate change and environmental policy. So the analysis draws on cross-national survey data from 26 countries. And it is my great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Jessica Kim from the Department of Sociology at the University of Pittsburgh. Jessica is a political sociologist whose work examines the cross-national diffusion, contestation, and transformation of liberal norms. Her research brings together global and transnational perspectives with advanced quantitative methods to study democracy, development, women's rights, and climate skepticism. Jessica's research has been supported by the National Science Foundation and has appeared in journals including Sociology of Development, Politics and Gender, Sociological Science, and Human Rights Quarterly. We are very pleased to have Jessica with us today. Thank you for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Ksenia, for the lovely introduction. You did such a great job. I'll very briefly just introduce myself before I dive in. So thanks again to the ISA for extending the invitation and providing me the opportunity to talk about my work. As Ksenia said, I am an assistant professor in sociology at the University of Pittsburgh, and I do study global trends in politics, and yes, multiple topics. I've looked at democracy, women in politics, but most recently my kind of budding line of work looks at climate skepticism. And of course, this is what I'm talking about today. This talk, Globalization, Populism, and Climate Skepticism, is based on a study that was recently published in Environmental Sociology alongside my co-authors Eliza Henry, Jared Carter, and Yasmin Soysal. And this paper aligns with kind of my broader interest in exploring the ways in which backlash to the liberal order is manifesting, and particularly seeking to understand how the global and political forces of the world are driving these trends. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and hop in. So I probably don't need to say this, but I will anyway. Obviously, the climate is in crisis. Oh, shoot, hold on. Sorry. This should be in presenter mode. Sorry, y'all. Okay, so like I was saying, the climate is in crisis. We have experienced the 10 warmest years in the historical record in the past decade. Global greenhouse gas emissions are at a record high level. And in response, the political right, yes, in the United States, it's always a great time to allude to Donald Trump, who was always making lovely illustrations for these talks. But around the world, we're seeing that folks are drawing upon populist narratives to sow doubt about the veracity of climate change, a phenomenon known as climate change skepticism. And that is the focus of this paper, trying to understand what explains this. And so what is climate change skepticism? Well, it has lots of variations and manifestations, but broadly defined, it entails some level of rejection of the notion that climate change is happening, what it's caused by, whether it's having an impact, and whether that impact is consequential or not. One particular form of climate change skepticism that we look at in this paper is impact skepticism. So unlike kind of broad climate denial, saying that the climate change is not happening, they acknowledge that, but rather impact skeptics doubt the seriousness or the negative consequences of climate change, and often even going so far as to emphasize its positive benefits. And we do actually find that this type of skepticism is manifesting at a global level. So these are preliminary kind of descriptive analyses from the ISSP data, that is the International Social Survey Program. We drew from the environmental survey, which is kind of specifically trying to hone in on environmental attitudes. And so here's a graphic of all of the countries and the average or proportion of people in each of those countries that exhibits impact skepticism. And so we can see that across all of these 26 countries, our global average totals to just under 20%. And that's effectively 1 in 5 people globally who believe that the positive impacts of climate change outweigh the negatives. However, broken down by country, we also see a great deal of variation across these different countries. And so that leads us to the question, of course, well, what's driving these differences, as well as the phenomena of impact skepticism in general? And so that is the question we aim to answer, particularly looking at populism, given the kind of contextualization of this rising trend, right? How does populism shape climate skepticism? And so to begin answering this question, we of course started with existing literature. And we wanted to look at explanations for skepticism that currently exist. There's a great foundational literature on this, looking at both country and individual level explanations. So I'll just go through these very, very briefly. At the country level, studies find that people who live in wealthier and more democratic countries, as well as countries that are experiencing climate vulnerability, as well as those that are more kind of tapped into the global system, are less likely to be skeptical. At the individual level, right, what are the individual attributes associated with skepticism or not? Well, people who are older, male, more religious, more conservative, less educated, from a lower socioeconomic background, and those who possess kind of traditional values are more likely to exhibit skepticism. And so on the whole, we've got a really kind of strong understanding of the various attributes that shape skepticism. But of course, you'll notice one thing that's missing, and that is, of course, populism, right? Very few studies have actually empirically studied this effect at either level, either the country level or the individual level, right? Are there country level manifestations of populism, and are there individual level manifestations of populism, and how does that impact skepticism? A lot of people theorize about it, but we don't really have a lot of empirical evidence on this yet. And so before we go any further, because we're centering on populism, we first, of course, need to establish what populism is. And so populism as an ideology thinks about the world as divided into two antagonistic groups. On one hand, the people and the elite, and it sees social life as an ongoing struggle between those two groups. The people are seen as virtuous and capable of self-governance, whereas the elite are seen as kind of corrupt and self-serving and fundamentally immoral. Now, populism has existed for a long time, but it has become increasingly salient in the context of globalization, and scholars are recognizing this, right? So they see that globalization, they theorize about globalization as one of the key drivers or mechanisms through which populism finds fertile ground, right? So just to very briefly address this, globalization as a project kind of offered the world, said that we were going to have great, prosperity and equality and flourishing, and of course, globalization largely failed to deliver on those promises to a large proportion of people. And so as economic crises loomed, economic insecurity and inequality increased, as well as social alienation, oh my goodness, and people became disillusioned. They became resentful, and they came to see globalization and its agents as something to be vilified, right? It's something that's prioritizing itself over citizen well-being. And so it's in this context that populism emerged as the framework onto which people could place or articulate their grievances stemming from the disruptive forces of globalization. What that specifically looked like, what aspects of globalization they were fed up with, varies. However, globalization is the underlying kind of driving force. And so more specifically, looking at this literature, we decided, well, let's not only look at how populism shapes skeptic attitudes, but also let's examine it in relation to globalization. You can't think about populism without looking at globalization. And so in this study, we look at the role of different populist varieties in general, as well as how they're contextualized by globalization. So let's go through them, right? What does this actually look like? Well, it's important to note that there are multiple variations of populism, and that's another one of the key kind of contributions or focus of this article. So although academics and public tend to conflate populism with its right-wing variety, right? I started the introduction with a particularly egregious tweet by President Trump. Populism itself is actually not partisan, right? It's a thin ideology that is neither inherently left or right, but rather it provides this kind of people versus elite framework onto which ideologies can then attach themselves. And so although right-wing populism has kind of been the most vocal and obvious manifestation, it is not the only one. But of course, I'll start by talking about it since it is probably the most familiar to us. So when we look at right-wing populism, each of these variations has kind of its conception of the people and the elite. It's just different. And so in right-wing populism, the people are kind of narrowly defined according to cultural kind of us versus them criteria, specifically drawing upon nativist and nationalist identities of us or we. And they frame the elites as those who uphold the liberal global order, particularly culturally, and advancing globalization. So people like cosmopolitan scientists, international organizations, and anything or any products that are the result of kind of increased cross-border flows of people, ideas, and goods. And we've got this nice little, example here, from Trump. He's just such an easy example. Concept of global warming was created by and for the Chinese in order to make the U.S. manufacturing non-competitive. We see kind of like global elites as vilified in support of kind of nationalist ideologies. So we're all probably very familiar with right-wing populism. However, increasingly in society and in academia, we're starting to see a greater attention to left-wing populism, and it's equally important when we think about its impact on climate skepticism. So left-wing populism, unlike right-wing populism, adopts a more inclusive and diverse conception of the people. It's based primarily on economic divisions where the people are marginalized, those people harmed by the effects of globalization. They're the most likely that are to be displaced as a result of climate issues, impacted by pollution, and they feel the negative effects of climate change the most. And so to them, the elite are those neoliberal corporations, governmental actors, those people who uphold structures of global capitalism that continue to engage in extraction and prioritization of profits over the environment that's leading to their plight. Okay, and so looking at both of these variations, we can understand how they would link to skepticism, but in different ways. On the right, we would expect a kind of rejection of the climate to occur as a result of right-wing populism. They see climate scientists and organizations promoting pro-climate narratives as kind of a villain of the kind of national image of the people, right? It's part of a broader conspiracy to continue advancing this cultural agenda that they've established for themselves. Whereas on the left, we actually expect a reduction, right? So because folks who endorse left-wing populism are directly experiencing the negative fallout of climate change, we would expect, of course, that they would have less skepticism because they're directly experiencing it. And then, of course, the question is also, well, how does globalization play into this? You'll notice that the people and elite definitions are inherently kind of embedded in this notion of globalization and different actors perpetuating it. And so we suspect that these relationships are exacerbated by globalization. On the right, globalization should enhance the role, its impact on skepticism. Similarly, on the left, globalization should produce a particularly strong reduction in skepticism. Now, we've got right and left. We may or may not know of this one. It's called valence populism. This one kind of sits in the middle. Not all populism has an ideological affiliation, right? So emerging research examines what's called valence or pure populism, and this invokes a set of very loosely defined anti-establishment and anti-corruption ideals without explicitly identifying who the elites are, or the people for that matter. They just see kind of the people as suffering at the expense of these kind of broadly defined, vague elites. And this is a very, very new term, and so very little work has been done on this variation, given its relative novelty. And so in this case, we don't really know what to expect. We do expect there is going to be some impact given the strong link between populism and climate and globalization, but we weren't really sure kind of what we were going to see. But we do look at it as well. So we're looking at all three variations of populism in general, and also in relation to globalization. Now, in addition to those things, the other question we need to ask is, through which pathways does populism flow? Right, so in addition to a kind of lack of research looking at the role of populism and its multiple variations, we also don't know where it comes from, right? Where does the influence of populism originate? And so there's two major kind of schools of thought. The first pathway is demand side. This approach emphasizes individual level factors. So it thinks about how individuals possessing certain attitudes, policy preferences, and identities foster a desire for populist intervention from the bottom up. The people are demanding a change. Whereas, on the other hand, we've got supply side, and this approach emphasizes instead the role of parties, right? Parties use political rhetoric because they are elites. They know how to package a political message. The people, there's theories of political science that say that the people don't really know what they want until they're told. And so from this approach, the supply side explanation, parties are using rhetoric to strategically amplify and disseminate populist rhetoric from the top down. So I know I've given you a lot of information. It's a highly complex phenomenon, but I'll try to summarize. Given all of this, we aim to explore how does populism, in both its varied ideological forms, right, left, and valence, and pathways, top-down versus bottom-up, shape climate skepticism in general, and how does globalization condition these effects, given that it is so central to the rise of populism? So, in asking this question, we offer a number of contributions to the literature. Number one, we simultaneously examine varieties of populism and their impact on skepticism, bringing attention to highly understudied variations of left-wing and valence populism. Number two, we compare the efficacy of top-down versus bottom-up pathways to clarify the way in which the mechanism through which climate skepticism manifests. We also examine the mediating role of globalization. That's number three. We know people theorize greatly about how globalization motivates and exacerbates populist reactions, but it's never actually been formally tested, so we do that here. And then finally, in pursuing a kind of cross-national large N approach, we expand the scope of existing work, which is primarily drawn from Western and small N case studies, to look at a more geographically diverse sample of nations that allows us to look kind of more broadly, get a greater generalizability and insight into impact skepticism as a global phenomenon. Okay, hope you're still with me. That is our setup. So now, of course, the question becomes, how did we do it? How did we go about answering this question? And so let's take a look at our data and methods. So our data, I've already mentioned this, our data come from the ISSP 2020 environment module, which is again a cross-national survey examining individual attitudes, particularly about climate change. We're left with about 28,000 individuals across 26 nations. And our dependent variable, of course, is impact skepticism, the thing we're trying to explain. So what does it look like specifically? Well, the ISSP asks one question on a scale from 0 to 10. How bad or good do you think the impacts of climate change will be for the world as a whole? And so you can answer anywhere from 0, from extremely bad, to 10, extremely good. And so low scorers, right, the people who say extremely bad, these people are the ones who see climate change as detrimental, recognizing its capacity to transform the global landscape for the worse, bringing about things like extreme weather events, deforestation, droughts, what have you. On the other hand, the extremely good folks, these high scorers, those are the skeptics, right? So this is a scale where increasing values is linked to greater impact skepticism. These people are those who are not convinced that climate change has a detrimental effect, even if it is real. You'll see arguments like the one I've provided here, right? More carbon is good for plants. The more plants you have, the more oxygen you have. We need oxygen. This is what we need, right? Hotter weather leads to greater biodiversity, less harsh winters, increased habitability for humans. It spurs technological advances. So you've got a number of kind of things that people draw on to say, yeah, climate change is good and here's why. So we evaluate where folks fall on this scale of 0 to 10. To analyze these data, we use multi-level modeling. This is a regression approach that allows us to recognize the clustering of individuals within countries, right? Individuals from the same country are more likely to be more similar to each other than they are to people within other countries. And this also allows us to simultaneously examine country and individual variables simultaneously, which is critical to our hypotheses and theory. Looking at populism in particular, of course, this is our independent variable. We draw upon a variety of sources that allows us to evaluate the intersection of pathway and ideological alignment. Now, I'll just say, you'll notice the data in this is not fully fleshed out. In other words, we drew upon what existed, we took what we could, but the study is exploratory insofar as there's not measures for everything. And we'll talk a little bit more about how this is an opportunity for future work. But here's what we do have. We've got on the left, I've got the pathway, and then on the right, we've got each variation of populism. So I'll start with the supply side. At the country level, we have country level measures of populism. These come from the 2019 Global Party Survey. This tracks the type of rhetoric used by parties worldwide, including things related to populism. So on the right wing, we've got nationalism. Right-wing party rhetoric that engages this idea of nationalism, highly aligned with right-wing ideologies. In relation to valence populism, we look more broadly at things that invoke general people sovereignty, giving power to the people without specifically identifying a villain. And you'll notice, of course, there are no left-wing data here, so that's a huge gap. At the demand side, at the individual level, we draw on additional survey attitudes from the ISSP. Again, you'll see that right-wing populism is the most fleshed out. This makes sense given the kind of over-attention to it in the literature, but we try to strike that balance here with what we can. So on the right wing, we've got 4 questions: distrust in universities, attitudes that are anti-immigration, folks that are anti-international organization, and also believe that we should limit foreign imports into our country. All of these kind of tie into that right-wing populist package of beliefs. And all of these questions are made into an index or a composite variable. On the left, we've got 2 measures that tap into left-wing populism: distrust in business and distrust in government. Remember, left-wing populists are fed up with corporations that are polluting the environment and the governments that enable them. Okay, and of course you'll notice also there is no kind of generic valence populism measure at the individual level. So again, we're doing our best. Not all data exists, but here's what we have. Okay. Going back to our measures, how do we look at globalization? Well, we use the measure of KOF, Globalization Index. It's a very well-known globalization measure. And then we interact that with each of our 4 measures of populism to examine its conditional effect. And then finally, we include a number of controls at both the country and the individual level. I'm not going to go through these. These are kind of our usual suspects, but I'm happy to talk more about it in the Q&A. Okay. Now finishing, of course, with results, the fun part. What did we find? So after analyzing our data, we looked at both kind of direct effects and interactional effects. I'll start with the direct effects. In other words, what is the relationship between populism and climate skepticism? Well, number 1, we found significant effects for all main effects tested. So looking first at country level, looking at the role of party rhetoric. Remember, we've got right-wing and valence rhetoric. We see that at the country level, both of these populist varieties linked to greater skepticism, and indicating that on the supply side, things are going well. Populism can flow in terms of top-down party rhetoric influences. Looking at the individual level, looking at this kind of bottom-up mechanism, we actually also see that the demand side holds its weight as well. As expected, right-wing populism is linked to greater skepticism, whereas left-wing populism is linked to less skepticism. So again, populism is very easily flows regardless of, the pathway. Okay, moving now to our interactional effects, right? How does globalization condition these relationships? Well, we find that at the supply side level, the party level, or the national level, that globalization buffers right-wing populism's skepticizing effects. So we've got these predicted margins here, differing predictions according to levels of globalization. So minimum globalization is the solid line, maximum globalization is the dotted line. And so you'll see in both of these cases, what is otherwise typically a very kind of high influence of right-wing populism on greater skepticism, when we've got a lot of globalization, that effect washes out. We suspect it's possibly because liberal climate norms that are kind of a part of globalization are able to circulate more widely, which generates competing pressures and limits what right-wing parties or narratives can accomplish. And so again, at the supply side, we find that globalization buffers skepticism. However, looking now at the demand side at the individual level, I'll start on the right wing because this is kind of most comparable. We see that the pattern reverses. So in our kind of low levels of globalization, this dashed line, we see that globalization amplifies right-wing populist skepticism. We expect this is likely due to kind of a reactive effect, people trying to reassert their identities in a context in which they don't feel empowered. And on the left-hand side, we also see that left-wing populism reduces skepticism regardless of globalization. Globalization really has no impact, right? It's robust and stable across contexts. It really doesn't matter if it's there or not. Left-wing populists are going to be left-wing populists regardless of the globalization they experience. And so all this is kind of a lot to digest, but I'll suffice it to say that the conditioning effects of globalization are incredibly varied. It's not a monolith, and it is particularly dependent on both level of analysis as well as ideological variation of populism, right? These things determine the story that globalization tells. And so what does it all mean? Why is this important? Well, let's talk through a couple of major takeaways from this research where I'll flesh out kind of like what we think about this and where to go next. So the first major takeaway is that all pathways are salient, right? Populism, as we saw, does not discriminate by pathway, whether it's bottom-up, individual, or top-down mechanisms. All variations of populism through these different pathways has an impact, indicating the robust link between populism and skepticism and the capacity for populism to shape beliefs through a diversity of channels. Our next major takeaway is that ideological position matters. And we've seen again in the literature a continued kind of conflation of populism with right-wing populism. By looking at all three variations, we show that it is really, really important to distinguish these. Right? Although all pathways are significant, the direction of these effects very much depends on the ideological position. So if we say populism inherently leads to skepticism, we're misrepresenting the data. Right, we find that that's true, but also left-wing and valence populism have their own impacts that need greater attention. And insofar as that's true, we argue that we as scholars and activists need to pay greater attention to left-wing populism's mitigating effect. People haven't really looked at this empirically yet, but we show that we need more attention to it. Left-wing populism, unlike right-wing populism, sees climate change framed as a consequence of elite exploitation as something that needs to be addressed, challenged, prevented, rather than something that's a hoax. And so we need to center these narratives more, and particularly those who are interested in kind of bolstering global climate action should consider the potential of left-wing movements to rally global solidarity in this way. The other thing about ideological position is valence populism. This is, again, it's such a new area, but we open up a new line of work to show that actually, at least in the case of climate, valence populism behaves very similarly to right-wing populism. We think that maybe this is because without a kind of like firm ideological anchor, right-wing populists can co-opt the kind of valence populist anti-elite narratives onto which they can kind of promote climate skepticism. But we still need more work to examine if this is true. And then overall, of course, this indicates that we need greater work to look at the very diverse manifestations of populism. Number three, the conditional role of globalization is highly complex, right? Globalization most certainly moderates the effect of populism, but it does so in unexpected and contradictory ways, right? It's not a uniform influence. And again, we've already talked about the kind of different patterns. Why do we think this? Again, on the supply side, we think that, well, at the global level, we're living in societies that are highly imbued with global kind of priorities and narratives, including pro-climate frames, which creates kind of tensions, and right-wing folks really can't get a grip in societies that have such kind of imbued global influences. On the other hand, where globalization is really only an emerging threat, right, when globalization is still very low, right-wing parties can amplify these fears, right? Globalization becomes kind of the boogeyman that's encroaching, and we have to prevent it, and that leads to greater skepticism. Whereas on the demand side, again, at the country level, we suspect that individuals themselves are most certainly reacting and reasserting their identities in response to the detrimental impact of globalization. However, this is really only occurring under a contingent of like certain people occasionally or ideologues, and it doesn't kind of manifest at the broader kind of country level. And then on the left, right, we see that actually there is no mitigating influence of globalization, but this also generates kind of a recognition, an opportunity. Left-wing populism really takes globalization to task, and yet it seems to make no difference in those societies where globalization is high. And so this indicates an opportunity for left-wing populists to take advantage of this kind of high globalization society when they live in them to further motivate activism in support of the climate. And then finally, our last takeaway is more data collection is necessary. We did the best that we could. I think we found a lot of really interesting things. However, of course, we're limited by existing data, so I would encourage future researchers to prioritize the development of left-wing measures of the people, particularly among individual attitudes, things like support for grassroots coalitions, or anti-capitalist beliefs, or anti-neoliberal social movements, or framing the oppressed as kind of these multicultural and globally interconnected people, and the elites as the 1% multinational corporations. Similarly, measures of valence or pure populism should also be included in standard questionnaires, as those are non-existent currently, practically. Okay. That is my major kind of summary. I want to just leave you, though, with answering the question, well, why does it matter? Why does any of this really matter? Well, I'll leave you with this idea. According to the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, they themselves recognize that systemic changes require broad public approval and social acceptance to be successfully implemented. In other words, we need the global public as a whole to recognize climate change's detrimental impact in order to foster transformative change. We need buy-in by the people. And if we can identify the variables, the things that kind of enhance buy-in or reduce buy-in, and strategically address those things, then we have a greater chance of kind of saving the environment and making real impactful climate change policy. Okay, that is all I have for you. Thank you so much. I look forward to your questions, and if you have anything to follow up with, my email is here, and I'm happy to chat. So I'm going to go ahead and unshare my screen so I can see everybody's lovely faces.
Thank you very much, Jessica, for a very interesting, very informative presentation. So the floor is now open for your questions, comments. You have two options. You can drop your message in chat, and then we will read it. Or you can raise your hand, and then you can unmute yourself and ask your question aloud. And as everyone is thinking, we have already the first question in the chat from Dr. Sumant. He's asking, how do social media networks help populist groups spread climate skepticism?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Dr. Hiramath. Oh, sorry. Did you want to elaborate at all, or do you want me to just go ahead and answer?
that's all question that, I mean, the question
Okay.
is formulated like this. So if
Okay,
you
okay.
have an answer.
So, yeah, I mean, it's a really great question. How do social networks and social media in particular amplify this? I think social media has such, an unparalleled capacity because of its lack of borders. Um, and so it remains an empirical question. I think other folks have looked at it, but it's a great thing to point out and say, like, yeah, this is one way in which we can spread both climate skepticism but also climate activism. So it's actually happening on both ends. But again, that is most certainly that's an empirical question. But I'm sure it has to do with the kind of ease and speed with through which information can travel across borders.
Thank you very much. So while everybody's thinking, let me ask you about the data set. So your analysis is based on a data set consisting of 26 countries. Were there any identifiable clusters of countries in which the relationship between populism and climate skepticism looked systematically different? Or were there any large clusters which were consistent and any outliers of the general pictures?
So, this is annoying. I want to share my screen, but alas. So looking at this graph of, let me try to do it anyway. Okay. Looking at this graph, right, of impact skepticism, looking across countries, we can see here we've got a variation. I wouldn't say there's necessarily large outliers. I think it's more interesting actually to see in some ways, who's higher and who's lower. In some ways, it's very unsurprising, the kind of like advanced industrialized democracies down here, France, Germany, Finland, Switzerland, Austria, Iceland, things like that, right? Kind of European usual suspects. And then up here, South Africa, Philippines, South Korea, India, more Eastern nations, more developing nations, or not high income or less industrialized. I'll just start. I'll leave you with this notion. It's interesting that the Philippines in our work, we repeatedly find that the Philippines exhibit an intense amount of skepticism. And so we're actually working to explore that more. Why is that, right? What is going on in the Philippines? Because it's also one of the most climate risk countries in the world. And yet we still see this. So they remain kind of like an interesting case study that, again, I'm currently looking to explore more. But generally speaking, I think the distribution is relatively kind of within expected bounds and distributed in ways we might expect.
Thank you very much. So I don't seem to see any hands yet.
Oops.
If you turn to globalization, right? So globalization plays a central role in your theoretical framework. Which dimensions would you say, the economic, the political, or the cultural, or maybe combined, do you think would be most relevant for understanding climate skepticism?
Yeah, that's such a great question. So, which types of globalization, right? Because we have a number of manifestations: economic, cultural, social. And if you're familiar with the KOF index, it's got so many measures. In our case, we looked at globalization as a whole. We wanted to look at the whole package. But I think, at least theoretically, and I think also empirically, folks could dig into this a little more in future studies. It's worth recognizing that certain aspects or dimensions of globalization resonate more or less with different variations of populism, right? So I already mentioned that left-wing populism is much more economically inclined. And so it might be, folks could look at how left-wing populism and economic globalization in particular tend to kind of be at odds. And the same thing on the right, how cultural globalization tends to kind of rile up the right-wing populists, because I think those are unique to the ways in which they conceive of the people versus the elite, particularly which global elites are we mad at. So I think it's a great question. We didn't actually look at this in our study. Again, we just looked at broad globalization because we wanted to get like the sweeping effects. But yeah, I think there's a ton of room here to look more into those kind of tensions and seeing if, populists are reacting to certain aspects of globalization or if it's just kind of the package as a whole.
Thank you very much. So we have one question now in chat from Anurialo. What the best ways to measure polarization are in your view, and to what extent they are applicable across cultures?
Oh my gosh, there we go. Okay. Sorry, my screen is being cuckoo. Okay. I wonder what the best ways to measure polarization are and to what extent they are applicable across cultures. Oof. Oh boy, that is a great question. I think polarization is slightly different from what we're looking at here, but of course it's related, right? So I imagine that political polarization creates grounds through which folks can more easily kind of engage in tribalistic, this is who we are, this is who you are, right? Left wing and right wing populism see themselves as, in a lot of ways, victims, validly victims of some type of like corporate or elite influence. But if we've got a lack of kind of like discussion across the aisle, it becomes much easier to fall into those kind of echo chambers or identities, and kind of hold on to this notion of what populism provides. So, how do we best measure polarization in that context, especially across cultures? There's lots of ways, right? And it's very interesting because I think each of our countries has a different like manifestation of polarization. I think the standard way has been looking at kind of the distribution of attitudes, right? Do we find that we have generally, a normal distribution? People tend to be in the middle, but here's a few outliers. A country like that would be relatively unpolarized, whereas a country that's got people on both sides of the aisle, kind of bimodal, lots of right wing, lots of left wing, and not a lot of people in the middle, that indicates to me a high degree of polarization. There's lots of other ways to do it, but that's where I would start, and I'm sure that could also shape the influence of populism and its capacity to kind of take hold in society.
Great, thank you very much. And we have one more question. How the duality of state role is taken care of. On one side, state wants to have development by exploiting nature, and on the other side, it spends to save our climate.
Yeah, Siraj, this is a great question. So I think the question is fundamentally states have competing and often contradictory goals that they are pursuing simultaneously. And how do we square that? And I think honestly the answer is we don't need to, or like this is happening in states all over the place, right? We have, forgive me for calling out the kind of rational choice theorist, but I don't think that states are as cohesive and intentional as we necessarily think. There's lots of different agendas and policies and motivations happening. And so, yes, it is most certainly true that on one hand, we're exploiting nature because we want to compete on the global market, and also we want to save our climate. It's also worth noting that this is not only the state influencing this, right? We know, particularly in the era of globalization, states, yes, often are engaging in kind of state-led development, but we're also seeing a huge rise of multinational corporations whose power challenges the capacity of states to really say anything, and they're just kind of the products of corporate, expansion. And so sometimes it's the state and sometimes it's not. And then the same thing goes for kind of, saving our climate. Some countries might adopt or, endorse broader kind of climate initiatives, but I think a lot of it actually comes from international organizations as well as global social movements, kind of the non-state sector that's engaging in this. So I think when we think about the duality of the state, it's almost a false dichotomy. We need to think of all of the other actors, not just the state. But as far as that's true, that the state is pursuing both, I think that's just an unfortunate reality of modern state making. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you very much, Jessica. If we go back to climate skepticism, so the paper treats climate skepticism as skepticism about the negative consequences of climate change. Would you expect similar patterns and interactions if we looked, for example, at skepticism toward climate science or opposition to maybe specific climate policies?
Yeah, that's such a great question, right? So we look particularly at impact skepticism, and we also really wanted to look at a measure that looked at the kind of global impact, people recognizing that um, this has global implications, particular given our focus on globalization. But yeah, I think that there's a strong reason to suspect that this is also happening with other variations of skepticism, right? Things like this policy is or isn't effective, or the kind of like mitigation. Sure, we can do what we want, but it's not going to make any difference, which is actually where most people tend to fall. We don't actually have a whole bunch of people who outright say climate change isn't real. We have these other kind of variations of skepticism. We tend to find that they correspond rather well to each other, right? There's a lot of indices that put these things together. So people who endorse one type of skepticism tend to endorse other types. That said, there is most certainly differences, and it could be a useful exercise to see which variations of skepticism are linked to which types of populism. Are there certain ones where populism really doesn't resonate? Maybe, maybe not. I think it also ties into again the question that's being asked, because populism is inherently looking at people versus elite, and is driven by globalization. So if it's associated, if the type of skepticism you can imagine theoretically is more linked to that, then I would suspect a greater correlation. But generally, my short answer is yeah, probably.
Thank you. And if you think about climate skepticism from the perspective of the respondents, since we work with survey data, to what extent do you think climate skepticism can be understood as a substantive disagreement with the climate change itself? And to what extent may it function maybe as expression of broader political identities, or maybe opposition to the elites, distrust in institution and similar phenomena?
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, Ksenia, that's a great question. So the question, of course, is like, are these populists really populists? Do they really know what they're buying into, or is it just a package that kind of corresponds? And I think it depends very much on kind of political savviness. We know that people's voting patterns. Some folks have a very cohesive sense of what their ideological package is. And those people, yes, it is most certainly part of their broader worldview. Whereas kind of less informed voters, often folks who are of lower education or social class, yes, I think it is probably a manifestation of like general grievances that doesn't really understand it as an ideological worldview, but nevertheless, it's resonating with them in some way. I think it would be very interesting to look at those different types of manifestations. But in the context of this study, it comes to the same thing. Whether you believe it because you're ideologically consistent or not, you still believe it.
Thank you. We have one raised hand from Dr. Sumant, so please go ahead.
Yeah, I congratulate Dr. Jessica Kim. It was a nice presentation. Yeah, I have just posted one. I'm a faculty in the Department of Sociology. So I just want to know through what sociological mechanisms does this climate skepticism transform from an ideological stance into a primary, say, marker of subcultural identity and group belonging in connection to comparisons to various countries, or any particular, you have any of those
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question, right? So, is climate skepticism, or rather, how does it begin as an ideology and then transform into identity? I don't have an answer to that. I mean, I can speculate. I think that it is very much um, kind of a reinforcing thing. You start by encountering this ideology that seems to resonate, and then it's kind of almost like a selection bias. You find you have a hammer and now everything's a nail, and so you start applying it, increasingly self-identifying with it, kind of tying things about your life and then your identity into that ideology, and then all of a sudden it's not just something you believe, it's who you are. And I think you make a really good point in recognizing that that funnel, because I think that is why for a lot of reasons populism has such a hold on folks, is because it isn't just something you can pick up and leave. It is seen as a part of oneself, as your fundamental identity. So how, I don't know, that's an open question. That's my best guess though, but I think it's such an interesting question. I don't know if you have any thoughts, but
Yeah, I feel that climate skepticism sometimes functions through subcultural identities.
mm-hmm.
Um, say, driven by the identity perspectives, some are with the symbolic protest, social standings, and all. So these are my few ideas. Still, I'm working on that. So somewhat it could connect it. So I thought of
Yeah.
letting you know from your ideas. Yeah.
Yeah, well, thank you. Let me know
Thank
if
you. Thank you. It was a nice.
what you find.
Yeah.
Thank you. We have one more question. Have you tested your findings in other large-scale data sets such as WS, EVS, or ESS?
Great question. Yeah. Ksenia and I were just actually nerding out about this. So, no, not in relation to this question in particular. We focused on the ISSP because the environmental module was so well crafted to the question we were asking. It had all of the variables, particularly in relation to environment, that we'd like. That said, I particularly like the World Value Survey. It's got even greater breadth and depth. It's got longitudinal capacities. That's it. ISSP. We've also done longitudinal studies, but in this case, the question was new, and I think that also speaks to the rather kind of novelty of these different variations of skepticism and people's increasing recognition that there's different dimensions. And so, yeah, the World Value Survey absolutely looks at climate attitudes, but I think the more kind of niche and specific questions were better suited to the ISSP. That said, that isn't to say that this won't change in the future. I think, again, it's also, the World Value Survey does ask climate questions, so I think it's worth exploring what can be explored from there. I think there's always more to be seen, and particularly I know you mentioned the EVS, and we've got the Afrobarometer. We can look at this regionally. There's so many great data sets that we could examine this process through, and that would only improve our kind of notion of validity across multiple studies. So I encourage you all to take up that charge.
And we encourage all survey projects to ask more questions about left-wing populism, right? And climate attitudes, of course.
Yeah. Yeah, it's crazy how very little even theoretical research there is on left-wing populism in relation to climate so far. So that is a huge opportunity for theorizing and empirics.
Thank you very much, Jessica. I think we have exhausted our list of questions. Many thanks for your very interesting presentation and for a lively discussion. It was a real pleasure to learn more about your research. Thank you very much for attending. I wish you a nice day. But before this, Jessica, floor to you for any last word that you would like to share.
Yeah, I just want to say thanks again for this wonderful opportunity. I really, really enjoyed talking with you all. I think it was such a great intellectual discussion, and I've learned a lot. I hope you've learned a lot. And so, keep in touch. Like I said, you know where to find me. And thanks for coming. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye.